Hello and welcome to this special one-off podcast episode. We're taking a break from the usual story savvy stuff to just record what the debrief could look like between a developmental editor and their client after they've had a chance to go through all of the notes. So to start off with, Agnes, was there anything in the feedback letter or the inline comments that was surprising to you or that you kind of felt blindsided by?
No, actually, I think that's a good place to be as an author is to not have been blindsided. There were a lot of things that I was like, I want to change this beforehand. And some of them, like I even talked to my husband, he says, no, don't change, make any changes, see what she has to say. So I think that this was probably an ideal type feedback because a lot of what you said, I actually had already had a little bit on my radar, and some of it I didn't know what to do with.
Sure.
And then there were some things, that I was just like, oh, I didn't think about that. But aside from that, I was very pleasantly surprised that I guess my intuition is correct.
Yeah.
Um, so
That's definitely like the best place to be in receiving dev feedback because I've been on both sides of that on getting feedback. I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of knew that was an issue and that came out of nowhere. So I feel like we're both in a good balance there. So what sort of things did I end up pointing out that were already on your radar that you now feel like you can have a better grasp on?
okay, so I first off, the beginning.
Mhm.
You had mentioned because I kind of had three starts, and I love all three starts. And the one that you recommended getting rid of is the one that I have actually gotten rid of maybe five or six times on my own. And I liked, but there's lots I love about it,
Sure.
and which is why I don't want to get rid of it. But
Mhm.
I liked some of the things that you said about you can always, when you're taking away a scene, use that as promotion.
Yeah.
And that I think that one would be a good one. And I also knew that it seems kind of awkward where because that scene since it's gonna I am going to take it out to a degree. I think I feel I can open up about it, but like so I had said the prophecy, and then you realize that the dad was telling the son the
Mhm.
prophecy. And like I knew that that wasn't quite jiving, and the way that you explained, like it just helped me have a better idea that even if I take it out, I might edit it in something that you had said and then use it as promotional.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of that was one of the big things. And then also I have three point of views, and part of the beginning too was because I love one of my point of views, and I was glad to hear that you liked it too. Um, but I also knew that having an adult for a middle grade point of view, what it was taking away from it, but I really didn't know what to do with that. And some of comments that you made me realize, okay, so I still can keep that like intro part, and I
Yeah.
still can probably keep one of the scenes that I have later on that I feel I could not effectively use from one of the kids' point of view and still keep that in. And
Yeah.
so then I was like, okay, so then it just made it so that because that was actually one of the biggest ones. It's like I didn't want to get rid of one of my main characters' point of view, but I also knew it was overpowering. So like that was good to hear from you.
And that can be a really tricky balance to strike. And I think that using that third POV when the other two protagonists aren't in the room, so they can't come from through their perspective is fine. But when one of the teenagers is there, yeah, probably coming through one of their perspectives is going to connect with your readers a lot better.
Yeah. And probably the biggest thing that you pointed out that I knew that I've known for a while, and I know why she's flat, but my main character is pretty flat. And like that was actually one of the things like right I was like, should I have her wait to in round this character out? But I think that I sent it at a good time because you were able to help me through some of your comments, you were able to help me realize, okay, so these are ways that I can help make her more round. So
Nice. Did any of those suggestions for how to do so particularly inspire or connect with you?
Um, Gotta think back because I read it a couple days, like a couple weeks ago, and then
Yeah,
I got sick, and so I
that's
haven't been able to do anything with it.
no worries.
There, let's see. Um,
It's fine if you don't have anything off the top of your head. I was just
Not
curious.
everything off the top of my head.
Fair,
There definitely was, but I can't think of it right off the top of my head.
fair. Yeah, I like part of what I like doing these debriefs is just seeing what connected with authors so that if I end up editing for them again, I can like dial in what kind of feedback I give and understand how their creative process works a little bit better. So, how are you feeling about my suggestion that you reduce the number of named characters that you have? Because I know that that's one a lot of authors struggle with.
Well, so I actually did some of my own research, and I
Okay.
don't know if I agree with you with that. That being
Okay.
said, I do think I need to dial back my. I do actually think I need to dial back my named characters.
Okay.
That being said, I don't know if I completely agree with everything you said about that. So
Okay. I'm
that
fascinated.
was one of them. Is so I literally took my favorite books,
Yep.
my favorite middle grade books, and went through and did the named characters. And I'm like, okay,
Okay.
we're reaching like 40, 50. And I'm like,
Hey.
okay. And like Harry Potter, the first one alone
Yeah.
had like 40 characters. Um,
Interesting.
and then
So,
like
were you able to come up with a list of that many names just thinking back on it, or did you go back into the book to make that list?
um, I was I did go back into the book,
Okay.
but that being said, I was still able to name quite. I read enough books though, so I know them pretty well. But like I went to Fablehaven, Percy Jackson, Harry Potter, and then some other ones. But I do think I do need to dial back my named characters. That being said, I definitely know where I can combine, and so I think that that comment was good, but I
Yeah.
also don't think I need to worry about it as much
Totally
as
fair.
so.
Yeah, no, that's a good sort of balance to land on. What filters are you planning to use for slimming that to whatever point you want to get it to? Are you going to slim folks who don't have lines, who don't play a major part? What sort of test are you going to put these characters to when you're making those decisions?
So one of the things that I do know is that some of them have stories later on,
Mhm.
and I think that some of them I may be able to introduce them later on, like in later series. Um, but I think that for the most part, I'm going to make sure I keep the ones that I know are going to play a bigger part later on.
Fair.
Um,
Fair.
but I definitely do think that there is some trimming that I could definitely do. So,
Cool. And is that basically where you fell on my suggestion that you slim the number of species, like magical species that you introduce, or are you
yeah.
going to try to keep all of them?
So I am going to reduce that for sure.
Okay.
'Cause that was actually one of them that was on my own radar.
Yeah.
Is so okay. So I started out with a lot of species. And then I took them away, and then like I added some back.
Fair.
But I do know that I think that when I added some back, those are probably the same ones I'm going to take away again.
Gotcha.
So
And it's worth bearing in mind that you don't have to establish all of the races in your world in book one. Like Harry Potter series is a great example of that because you don't even hear about house elves until the book where they become relevant, and you can absolutely do that with your world building.
yeah. And I think that some of them I just added just because I think they're neat and not necessarily because they actually play a big part.
That's fine.
So the Knolls are one of the examples. Because like I knew that there are several, but those can all be tied into a different species that I don't actually think that I need that one in at all, like
Fair.
in any of the books. That one can just be like,
Yeah.
"Highway."
And maybe they can feature heavily in your next series if you feel inspired.
I
Cool.
think I had a lot of fun with the world building, but I did actually trim down quite a bit and then I added some back in. Um, and there is some main characters, or not main, minor characters that are named that I might combine into one, which then would actually take away a race as well.
Nice. I
So.
think that's a good approach. So out of curiosity, were there any other points that you thought I had a point, but you disagree with me on how you're going to approach it? Because again, that's great. I'm curious to hear about that.
Um, the named characters was probably the biggest one that I like. I don't fully disagree. Like you definitely have a point. But I actually, because that was actually something that was on my radar at first.
Gotcha.
And I was like, I'm making too many characters. And so I already, because I are, and then I started to think about, okay, some of my favorite characters, some of my favorite, and I'm like, there are a lot of named characters. And then I had been reading a book too at that point of time when it was crossing my mind. And I was like, okay, I'm not crazy to have, but I do think that having like there are some where I have too many new characters in that particular scene, whereas I could probably bring just one. And I don't think that it would change anything further down the road either.
Okay.
Like, so
Well, I will
that was
say that you did a uniquely good job of not having any names that were confusing with other names, which is an issue that I'll see. You'll have like a Stephen and a Stefan, and I'm just looking at the book going, please pick something else. So you had none of those issues, which is great. How are you feeling about your momentum? Because I know that one of your primary concerns before I even got started was possibly having some scenes that felt a little bit pointless or like they weren't driving momentum. Are you feeling like you got help around that, or are you still feeling kind of stuck?
that's probably where I felt like I got the most help.
Awesome.
And
Okay.
because I think the beginning chapters are some of those, like, because to me, they're very important and
Mhm.
I know why they are important. But I think some of the questions that you asked me helped
Mm,
me realize, okay, I'm not pulling out what is actually important in this scene.
yeah.
One is where the brownies are making something, and I realized, okay, I think I added an element that I didn't need, which is actually her anklet. Like,
Mhm.
um, I don't think that part I need, but I do need the compasses that and I think I also had that in her perspective, but he's actually the one that, or the main male character is actually the one that has the biggest stake in that one.
Uh-huh.
And so I realized I need to change the point of view character. And I think that's a big part of what is wrong with that particular one. But I
Nice.
know I put hers because she likes that. That was like her, what she loves
Yeah.
in life. And just realizing, okay, no, but he has the biggest stake in it and having it from his perspective. And I think that I really appreciated some of the questions that you asked because I knew that there was some problems there, but I wasn't quite sure how I could how I could pull out what I actually was important in those scenes. Because there was, you have talked about in one of the episodes that we had done about how you want to start as soon as the big thing happens. But I
Yeah.
knew I couldn't fully do that. I knew I needed to step a little bit back. And, but I also knew that there was some problems there. And I just really appreciated some of the questions that you asked me that helped me be like, okay, this is why I saw that there was problems and she's seeing the same problem. And now I'm able to, because of the questions that you asked, I was able to be like, okay, now I know what I need to do to strengthen it. So.
Awesome. Glad to hear it. I know that one of the other things that you'd asked me to keep an eye on, just going into the dev edit, was your use of backstory. And you've mentioned this in some of the Story Savvy episodes as well. And I'm aware that a lot of the feedback that I gave you on that was you're doing fine. So how are you feeling about that? Do you feel just reassured that you've already done this, or are you wishing that I'd given you more feedback on that?
Um, well, that was actually something that was probably my biggest first round of edits is because first off, my first original book, my original, I had about 5 chapters at the beginning,
Yeah.
and that I spent a long time on that did not make it in the book at all. I mean, but it was basically because it was backstory.
Yeah.
And then, and I do know that I have some backstory that I was debating that I realized that I cannot have in the first book
Mm.
because I think it would leave too much wanting at the end of the first book. And I realized I need to introduce it in the second book. But I did intentionally leave a couple Easter eggs in that when people read the second book, they'll be like, oh,
Perfect.
but I did
Yeah.
it in such a way that I was hoping nobody would catch on the first
Excellent.
book, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I remember there were a couple of things that I pointed out of, oh, you set this up perfectly to pay off when it finally gets revealed in the climax or whatever. So love to hear that you're planning those things for the whole series as well. So the there was one piece of feedback that I gave you that I was a little bit nervous to give because it felt like it was such a big thing and I don't want to, overwhelm anyone. How are you feeling about my suggestions for reworking that midpoint shift and the
Oh,
climax to be a little bit like totally restructured?
that's actually that's something that I've played with in my head as well, and probably going to be the hardest part to implement because so I when I did my outline, I did it according to the beats in Save the Cat.
Okay.
That was those were the beats that I chose when I set it up. And as I was writing, I realized things shifted a little bit from the original outline. And that was when I told you there was a plot hole. Like I told you, like right before I sent, that was actually a big part of it, is I realized I need to restructure that. I do agree with what you had said. At this, and there was something that you had said. I wish I could remember now, where I realized, oh, I'm going to change this here. But I think that's probably going to be the biggest part of in my edits, where like I that one was another one of those where I knew on some level like I need to restructure, but at the same time, I was feeling a little bit at loss. And I think some of it is that during my original plotting, um, some of that was combined together and then I separated. And
Yeah,
now I need to like make sure that I'm still hitting all of those points. But I think some of the restructuring will help by taking out some of Novak's perspective.
sure.
And also, I think some of the things that will help too is really focusing more on Amelia's perspective, um, which are two things I already knew. And I think those two things will also just naturally help some of that restructuring of the climax, the midpoint shift. And but I definitely I did agree with you. Um, but that's definitely where I need to still kind of ruminate on it a little bit more before I know what I'm
Absolutely.
thinking with it.
Yeah. So curious, I definitely gave you sort of here's the next steps that I recommend after consuming the feedback. Was any of that helpful, or are you going to go off in a completely different direction for how you approach the rewrites and the self-editing after the developmental feedback?
No, I thought that was very helpful. So that's I definitely appreciated that. And I tell my husband this all the time. So like I am an entrepreneur in that, like I started my own business and like everything I've ever done, if you look at my like work history, I'm 43 years old and my work history, I have been self-employed almost that entire time.
Nice.
And even when I wasn't, but that being said, so you would think, I am an entrepreneur, like I want to do my own thing. I know my direction. I always tell him that I'm a better peon worker than I am like an entrepreneur. Like I need that like you got to do this, that. So I appreciate that because then I'm like, okay, so now I have an angle to go. And I think that's that ADHD because like I know myself, like I run 500 miles per hour in one direction, and that's not always helpful because sometimes you have to run back that same direction to course correct what you're trying to work for towards.
I will say it's fun doing a developmental edit for someone that I know as well as I know you, because I kind of had that in the back of my head of, oh, yep, she's talked about the ADHD. She's talked about just wanting the next steps written down. I can do that for her. So,
Yeah. I joke because my husband's he's more analytical like you. Like he is my like I'm the peon person, the person who you like literally say, okay, you need to do this, this, this. And I'm like, okay, I got it. This I can do. And
Sure.
it's not that I don't like, I definitely have the entrepreneurial spirit where I like, and I think as a writer, you have to have a little bit of that where I can just go with something. But I do have a tendency to go with something too fast and end up scrapping 95% of it because I was going 500 miles per hour in the wrong direction. So.
I feel that to a lesser scale, absolutely. So I'm curious, I had you mentioned that you've already started writing the next book in this series or started
I've
outlining?
out I've outlined it. And I actually from this will sound kind of weird. So I in college I had created Blaze, the character. And I knew that his bonded mate, whatever you want to call him, that's one of them that I'm going to be working on. But I knew what the bond was like back
Sure.
in college. And so that would be like 25 years ago
Nice.
so yes, I am that old. Um, but so like I had those characters for a very long time. And I also had Julian and someone else's character that I'm not can't mention yet. I've had them forever. And then when my daughter was born, I knew I wanted to write a story about this, but none of them seemed like they worked out well. And then it was like one moment, I was coming home from therapy, and it was like in that moment, I had first, second, and third book already written in my head.
Nice.
And that was because I finally had the direction. I I knew what Amelia had to go through.
Mm.
And I think that's partly why she's somewhat flat, actually,
Oh,
is
okay.
because I think that I need to separate her from me
Ah,
because
yeah.
I think I'm too afraid to explore some of the stuff. And so I need to separate. And that was something that I think I kind of already knew. But that was also why I ended up having the first, second, third. And so like I outlined all of them right away and knew exactly what's going to happen. That being said, I think there's going to be 4 books now because there
Nice.
is something that I don't think that I can effectively do yeah.
Well, that's
So there,
exciting. So what aspects of the developmental feedback that you got on book one do you think are going to have the biggest impact and just sort of changing how you're approaching book two or how that's going to get written?
definitely the thoughts on Amelia's character growth, the stuff that I need to add there, and also taking away Novak's perspective quite a bit because there's there's very few scenes that he would actually need to, and I might even be able to take him out completely, except for I do want to keep the prologue. And I have not decided because there is that like 3 stars. I haven't decided on the very
Yeah.
first 'cause I am very attached to that, and I figure I don't have to make a decision right now. I can see what beta readers think, and maybe I'll send some of them with that and some of it without, and see what they say.
But I'm not sure I worded my last question correctly, so my apologies for that.
Sorry.
How do you think the feedback on book one is going to affect books two and three and four?
Uh, yeah, you asked the question correctly. I started to answer and then I like got sidetracked.
Gotcha.
So yes, no, I think that it will really help, especially because I'm going to be focusing a lot more on Amelia's point of view and taking away some of those other point of views. So I know that it's going to really shape it. It also, I think, is going to help in that just thinking about like that midpoint shift. And I think that going into as I'm fleshing out number two, to really make sure that especially if I make a big change like I did in the first book, of really thinking about where that is. Because like I had it all fleshed out at the beginning. Then when I made a change, I kind of let everything kind of settle where it's rather than thinking about where it needed to settle.
Sure.
So I think like going into that, so that way there'll be hopefully less major edits with the second, third, fourth book.
That is thankfully almost always the case. The first one is where we have the most room to grow, and that learning curve does get less steep as we go along, thankfully. So, how are you feeling about the like particularly your non-negotiables, but also just the general hearts of your stories that I know we've talked about on the Story Savvy podcast in the past?
I don't, I know there was one thing that you had thought what was a non-negotiable that really wasn't. It was
Okay.
just because I think how I vision it is different. And it's the
Okay.
wording choice, the dragon mate, and I didn't make a total association like what's now known for.
Well, I
I'm
know
like,
that one of your other non-negotiables had just been that your protagonist wasn't a natural-born fighter, and I know that I made quite a few notes that was very specifically clarifying, like, hey, I'm not suggesting that you make her, have a different personality. I'm just suggesting that you show it more. So, how are you feeling about that non-negotiable and the other hearts of the story?
I really didn't feel like any of your suggestions challenged any of that. I think that they just mainly strengthened what like sh they will help me strengthen what's already there. I did not feel like you contradicted any of my non-negotiables at all. Um, I think you gave some good feedback that will help strengthen it though.
Nice. And do you think that you will be able to deliver your message or your theme more strongly with the feedback, or do you think that the changes that you're planning to make based on that feedback are going to tweak how that comes across?
I think definitely it will strengthen it. And that was the biggest part because of you saying, the fact that Amelia was so flat. I think that is the hugest part of it. And it was like one of those things I'm aware of, but it was hard to get over the hump. And you asked some of really good questions that are going to help me move forward, I think. Um, I really appreciate some of the questions that you asked because it was like, oh, so I did not make this clear, or oh, I
Yeah.
did not think about that. So
Good. Well, I'm very glad to hear that. Yeah, so unless you've got more questions, I suppose we can wrap up here. This was kind of one of the easiest debriefs I've ever done.
thank, well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
No, I didn't have any major questions, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I was kind of curious, like what some of the things that you were going to say that I might not have thought of. And maybe there's a little bit of disappointment that a lot of the stuff I'd already thought of, but there were definitely things that I did not think about that you definitely brought up, but nothing major. And they were all like, oh yeah, I should do. Okay, yeah. There was nothing where I was like, probably the only thing that I really disagreed with you was
Yeah.
the named characters, and yet it was good that you brought that out because you have really good points, and I do need to bring it down. I just don't think I need to bring it.
As down as yeah, that's totally fair.
Yeah,
And that's why I have disclaimers in my letter, like, hey, if you disagree with me on something, cool. Just
yeah.
think about it first.
But
So yeah,
I think from an author's point of view, when we're getting feedback from a development editor, like especially like with that sort of thing, is go back and do your own research too.
yeah,
Because for one thing is like some of them that you might love, like if when you're reading a middle grade and you're like some of them you're thinking, okay, when I could look at those ones and I do my own research, I'm finding this, that, and the other thing. Whereas when I'm thinking, oh, the ones that I love, and then I realize that mine are actually not, because like
right,
we might be looking at two different audiences. And
absolutely.
that's something I think that as an author, when we're getting our feedback from our editor, realizing that, that we might be looking at
Yeah,
different audiences and what different audiences want.
right. And as much as editors, I assume I can speak for most of them as well as myself, we try to be objective and we try to draw from the established patterns and the established, genre tropes, but at the end of the day, everything is going to be a little bit subjective because we are living, breathing humans with our own preferences and our own mindsets going into this. So with you going through a book, you could name 40 something characters. When I think back on all of my favorite YA, including Harry Potter, I can't name nearly that many characters, but that's probably just because my brain doesn't remember names that well or the impact of lesser characters as much. So I think it's great that you only had one point that you're like, nope, That's a better number than average. So yeah, I'm excited to continue doing the Story Savvy series. We'll continue on that pattern on your regular scheduled programming, and I'm excited for the upcoming topics, including the ones in the later series that get into sort of the line level, like typos and commas and all of that kind of stuff that I touched on a little bit in your inline notes. So I'm excited to keep moving forward and very excited to get your book released and out into the world so I can start sharing it to my friends.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you so much for listening to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. I look forward to bringing you more content to help you make your good story great so it can change lives and change your world. Follow along to hear more, or visit my website linked in the description to learn how I can help you and your story to flourish. See you next time.